Joining me again tonight to fill in for Rowan Dean while he's on leave is Dr. Jennifer Oriel, columnist at The Australian and a very genial, if even elegant, face of common sense. Jennifer, great to have you on the show. I want to get on to other issues, but just I want your take. You've analysed this issue of abortion law and really the politics, the management of politics by Gladys Berejiklian. How tough is this for the Premier, do you think?
Oh, it's incredibly tough, and it's why part of the reason abortion's put to conscience votes so often. I think one of the things that's not discussed here, I've, historically taken a strongly feminist position on abortion, and by that I mean that I put the women's right to control our own body ahead of the rights of the fetus. That, for me, changed when the scientific information changed, and what happened was that they discovered that fetuses are capable of feeling pain, well, that's the theory. And when fetal pain capability came into play and the scientific research from the US indicated that it was a really serious issue, it was originally used in cardiac surgery on infants. It wasn't anything to do with the politics of abortion originally, this research. And it only came to light that fetuses as young as around 20 weeks were showing pain responses to stimuli. And further research was done, and it was compelling enough for people to start thinking about late-term abortions and what that meant for fetuses. I mean, you don't want to go into the detail on television at this time, but for me that changed my view of abortion quite significantly. And I feel that the laws should reflect that research. We should at least take a scientific approach to this. And feminists around the country are just refusing to, and I think that's pretty dreadful. And so I think, Gladys Berejiklian is between a rock and a hard place, but she needs to show some moral courage on this. There are issues that are more important than a political career, and one of them is what looks from the research to be utterly abhorrent treatment of fetuses that can actually feel pain.
Yeah, and I have to go again, if you want the feminist position, the gender most likely to be removed from the womb is always the young girl. It happens overseas, the numbers are there, it's fact, yeah. And unfortunately it's likely to occur here in Australia with the sanction of our government, which I find just pretty awful to contemplate. All right, let's move on to some other issues. Parliament was in Canberra today. It's going to sit right till the end of the week when the Prime Minister heads off to Washington for a pretty extraordinary trip. Yes, everyone's talked about the state dinner, but I'm also very interested in the fact that he and Trump will do a joint visit to Ohio to a Pratt Industries plant and to usher in or welcome in the investment and jobs in that country. I wish we could see a bit of it here, but we'll wait and see that things turn around. I'm interested in the big stick legislation. It passed the party room, that's the Liberal Party room, joint party room with the Nationals today, and it'll likely be introduced into the Parliament. Now, there are some Liberals who are up in arms about the concept, Jennifer, of intervening in the market. But, of course, my argument there is this is not a real market. Our energy market is a flawed market. It's a market that isn't really working. Do you think that they'll get the support of the Parliament here?
Oh, I think they should. I mean, I can't see an argument against it. There's a fairly purist line that the Liberals shouldn't interfere in the free market, but that's, as you say, it's assuming that it actually is a free market. A highly subsidised green market is not a free market. It's giving preference to renewables industries, green technologies over coal. It's unfair competition. So the government has been intervening for some time, and this is a corrective. It's an attempt at a corrective because the green energy companies are using those subsidies to create even monopolisation and unfair competition. So the government has to act, and I think that Australian households are really hurting at the moment. Cost of living is still pretty extraordinary, and wages are not rising to compensate for that. I'm not sure many Australians will be upset if the Morrison government walks out with a big stick and gives the green energy barons a whack to reduce prices. We're all for companies making good profits when it increases the prosperity of Australia overall, when it's in the national interest. But at this stage, it looks as though there's some serious price gouging going on, and that has to be corrected.
And just to stay on energy, Labor today, Bill Shorten and also Penny Wong are still backing in the policies they took to the election in May. Some in Labor are saying they need a rethink. Others are saying we'll still stay with the 50 and the 45% targets. We'll just push out the delivery date from 2030 to 2035, let's say, as an example. Do you think Labor have have hit rock bottom yet and started to climb back up in terms of analysing why they lost the election, or are they still in denial?
Well, they're still in denial, aren't they? I mean, this cost the Liberals as well. This, the carbon tax, the emissions intensity scheme cost the Liberals a lot of political capital. And they only learned after Malcolm Turnbull was rolled that they weren't going to go back to that sort of approach. But the problem with Labor is that it just doesn't seem to be learning. I mean, every election it keeps doing the wrong thing. And we know that at the last election, the really big issue with Shorten and Labor's energy policy, climate policy and the 2030 target was that they wouldn't cost it. They were expecting Australians to write a blank cheque for an uncosted policy. And when Brian Fisher, when an independent economist tried to cost it, and it looked like billions of dollars of hit to GDP, he was treated appallingly by Shorten. So I think that Labor's they're not learning on a number of fronts, and in part it's because they're trying to really appeal to the Green left. They've got a very substantial sustained vote across the eastern seaboard in the inner cities, and the Green left sort of surrounds of the inner cities in Melbourne and Sydney. But they lost the election in Queensland, and they don't seem to have learned the lesson from that. If they are going to come back, they're going to have to grapple with their real existential dilemma, which is that they've got two very different classes of voters now, and they can't afford to let the workers go. And they're really punishing the working class at the moment in an attempt to appeal to their urban enclaves.
Archbishop of Sydney, Archbishop Fisher was out today, really concerned, I think, about the legislation regarding religious freedom and the right of schools to employ teachers who agree with, support and teach a Christian-based ethos, whether that's the Catholic ethos in those schools, obviously a different faith in different schools. I know the Jewish schools have the same concerns, Muslim faith schools as well. He fears, Archbishop Fisher, that the activists out of the same-sex marriage debate and others will try and use faith-based schools, or Christian schools in particular, in his case Catholic schools, as a bit of a wedge on this issue, as an activist platform to take a few test cases through the courts in the hope that schools will basically have to stop being faith-based schools, stop teaching their particular religious ethos. Is he right to be concerned?
Absolutely. I mean, international precedent shows that Christians are by far and away the most common target of queer activists. And when I say queer, I don't mean people who are gay or whatever. I'm talking about a particular ideological position that's much more radical than gay liberation, much more radical than even lesbian feminism was. And it really takes the extreme libertarian view on sex and sexuality and gender. The problem is that they're highly litigious activists. When gay marriage is passed in a context without sufficient religious freedoms, it empowers state-funded prosecution of dissenters. And what we're seeing in a number of countries is that if there aren't sufficient religious freedoms in place, the punishment is the process. So even when Christian leaders or Christian business owners are cleared legally, they usually have to suffer such incredible reputational damage and such terribly lengthy, protracted cases that their businesses close down and they just don't want to fight anymore. And it's a bit like using them as an example so that people simply don't want to fight against queer ideology anymore. In the case of Bishop, yes, there is absolutely a valid concern about that in Australia. The religious freedom protections have not been brought into legislation, despite the Liberals saying that would soon follow hot on the heels of same-sex marriage legalisation, and that's a real problem for Australia. We would expect to see more such court cases come into play, and you can bet that Christians will be targeted because they're the only group that is considered really deserving of persecution in Australia. They're an easy target, and the activists are pretty intent on, some activists are pretty intent on making them a public example.
I want to flick to the UK because I look at a lot of these gender issues in the United Kingdom, not because I'm ever going to vote the United Kingdom or I'm running a show for viewers in the United Kingdom, but often it's the template that's being imported into Australia. It's happened in the last few years and I'm seeing more and more evidence, and often this is the case in politics too. Parties look abroad and try and replicate policies here in Australia. Three things that struck me worth noting. It's likely the census, the UK census in 2021, will allow people to pick their own gender, so disregarding their birth certificate, whatever they feel like on the night of the censorship survey, they will be able to tick that box and list their gender or not gender or a range of genders. Also, the NHS, which is their equivalent of Medicare, has put out guidelines in relation to Greater Glasgow and the Clyde area in Scotland. This is nursery school, so this is childcare centres, kindergartens, etc. They're asking teachers not to use the term boys and girls because they say, and I quote, language is a sliding scale of violence and it leads to stereotyping, can have a huge impact on children, the mere term boys and girls, but also more guidelines from the Equality and Human Rights Commission that also don't want to see girls be able to use a shared bathroom if they want to just go in there to a female toilet. They are now being told that if transgender children want to use that bathroom and the girls want to use a bathroom that used to be just a girls' bathroom, well, the girls have to move, not the transgender kids. I mean, it's complicated and crazy, but this is what we're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, what happened to calling out male privilege, Peter? This is quite incredible stuff, isn't it? That the transgender sort of lobby, and it is an international movement, that's what I mean by lobby, it's an international political movement, and it's very aggressive. Feminists have felt the brunt of it for many years. I know feminists like Sheila Jeffries who wrote a book on transgenderism and suffered quite significant action against her by transgenderists. And we're seeing now this constant encroachment into private life, into the intimate sphere, and it's really concerning. It's a very aggressive front, and we need to try to resist it. There's a number of things, there are a number of problems with this movement. First is that it's predicated on an absolute lie. You cannot change birth sex. You can play around with gender, but you can't change birth sex. A man cannot become a woman and a woman cannot become a man, except for the less than 1% of the population who are born with intersex conditions, and that's an entirely different case. But we're being then compelled to entertain this lie by governments who say you have to recognise a man as a woman if he says he's a woman, and vice versa. We shouldn't actually be allowing this to happen. We shouldn't allow governments to force us to lie. And if people want to identify as transgender and they want to use the bathrooms or the private areas of another sex, they simply shouldn't be allowed. If women don't want men in their bathrooms and in their toilets, that's perfectly legitimate. And part of the problem is that there's a lack of recognition, a lack of balance in this debate about girls' bodily integrity, girls' right to privacy, girls' right to safety. And none of this is being considered because of the very, very noisy minority of very, very aggressive transgender activists who won't allow anyone to speak in this space. It's militancy, and it's really militancy. And it's the most
and women have waited a
aggressive
long time for some of these rights.
Yeah, that's right. And look, unfortunately, the fact is that there are a number of cases on the books now where men who are, how can I put this, men who are predisposed or given to behaviours that we would regard as sexually abusive are using transgenderism to get access to women's prisons, to women's rape centres, to women's toilets. And at some point, women have got to band together and say, enough is enough, and we're not allowing men, whether they call themselves women or not, we're not allowing sexual abusers into this space. It's absolutely unacceptable behaviour.
Well, Jennifer Oriel, we cover the field there with a range of issues. Thank you very much. As always, thanks for your time tonight.
Thanks, Peter.